Okay, so it's okay. Anyways, so my book was Atonement, and it's by McEwen, and it was published in 2001, I think. And I totally agree with Dan that it should at least be considered for the AP English curriculum because it is a modern classic. It feels like one when you read it, and thematically it has a lot of depth. And it's divided into 3 parts and then an epilogue. And so, just to kind of go through the plot of part 1. So, and all of these are pictures from the movie version, which is actually really good. And so, while reading the book is the best thing, if you want to just get a good feel for the book, you can just watch the movie because it's a really good version of it. In part 1, Bryony is she is a 13-year-old girl, and she's an aspiring writer. She writes this. They live on their family's country manor home, and she writes this little play because her cousins are coming to stay with them because their parents are getting a divorce. This is 1935, so that's kind of unheard of. And so she writes this play called The Trials of Arabella for her cousins to perform for her brother, who's also coming in. And her sister Cecilia is also home from Cambridge for the summer. And from a window, Bryony kind of witnesses this encounter between Cecilia and the gardener's son, Robbie, who is also at Cambridge and an outstanding student and wants to go to medical school. And where Cecilia has a family heirloom vase, and then Robbie breaks it, and it, like, the piece falls into the water of their big fountain, and so then Cecilia strips down and goes and dives in and gets it, and so it's just kind of an awkward encounter, and what Bryony sees is, Robbie standing in front of her, and she's just undressing, and so she thinks that he has some kind of control over her sister. And then later, Leon, her older brother, and his friend Paul Marshall, and they both come in town, and they're having a family dinner, and Robbie kind of sends a note apologizing for the earlier incident, but it kind of contains some explicit language on accident. He wrote a draft that was a little explicit because he has a big crush on her, and then he accidentally sends that one through Bryony, who reads it and is really disturbed, and then Cecilia gets it, and then Robbie comes up for the dinner, and then they have sex in the library, and Bryony walks in on them, and it's consensual, but Bryony interprets it as being rape. And then the twins go missing, and everyone goes out on a search party. And the oldest cousin, Bryony, walks upon the oldest cousin, Lola, being raped. And all she sees is that it's a man, but she firmly believes that it is Robbie. And so they get back to the house, and she accuses him, and he's arrested and taken off to jail. And so the whole tone of this section is, the language he uses is very flowery and descriptive and borderline stream of consciousness. And which, I haven't read a whole lot of British literature, but from my research, it kind of echoes, the writing of Virginia Woolf and other authors who were writing during the time in which the novel is set. What's interesting about this section is that the scene with the vase is seen through 4 people's perspectives. It's first seen through Bryony's eyes, and then through Cecilia's eyes, and then through Robbie's eyes, and then kind of through the ears of their mother, who is up in her room with a migraine, just kind of hearing various things going on. And so it's interesting how it's a third person, it's written in third person, but from different perspectives. And then when it's in Bryony's perspective, it's also third person omniscient. And then part 2 is all from Robbie's perspective, and it's set while he is fighting in France in early 1940, moving towards the evacuation at Dunkirk. And so it consists of various flashbacks, and then so Robbie flashes back to his time in prison, which was horrible, and then it flashes back to that brief time between prison and going off to a war when he meets up with Cecilia for lunch. And it's an awkward lunch, but that's still the memory he takes with him to France. And the language here is very different. The whole attitude, it's kind of got this feeling of just darkness and, gray and overcast, and it's very gory and pretty graphic descriptions of war. And towards the end, he's wounded and then develops a fever and begins to become delirious. And while waiting to be evacuated, he falls asleep. And so this is kind of, I guess, detailing the way Robbie suffers for, Bryony's accusation. And also it's revealed that Bryony has decided to give up Cambridge and instead become a nurse. And in her letter, Cecilia says she thinks that this is a way that Bryony's trying to make amends for her accusation and what she's done. And so then in part 3, Bryony is working as a nurse, and it's hard, they're really oppressive, and she has an encounter with a French soldier named Luc, and it's kind of, the encounter kind of seems really out of place, and then you don't really understand the reason for it at first. It's just kind of random little scene thrown in there. But as actually, I will explain it when I get to it because it'll be so explained. And then she also goes to Robbie and Cecilia and apologizes and says that she wants to recant her confession because Paul Marshall and Lola, the cousin who was raped, are getting married, which makes Bryony realize that it was actually Paul Marshall who raped her, but now he can never be accused for his crime because they're now married. And but Robbie and Cecilia still live happily ever after together. But then it goes to the epilogue, which is set in London, 1999, and Bryony is an old, successful writer who is dying of vascular dementia, and she's just completed her novel about her sister Cecilia and Robbie and herself as a child and young woman. And she reveals in this section that Robbie and Cecilia did not actually live happily ever after, that Robbie died of his wounds at Dunkirk and Cecilia was killed a few months later during the Blitz. And so, which kind of puts the first 3 sections in perspective, because you realize, oh, so you ask the question, well, why did they change the ending? Well, it's she's trying to atone for her mistakes. It's like, okay, well, they died in real life, so in the story, I'm going to make them, live together happily. And also, then you look back on the Frenchman, and she talks about her husband, who was also French, and they, spent a lot of years together until his death. And you realize, oh, so the French soldier was kind of like, it was like he was her husband, but he died prematurely before they were able to spend years together. And so he just kind of symbolizes another way that she tries to atone by fictionally killing her husband before they even really get to spend any time together, just like what happened with Robbie and Cecilia. So she's doing it to herself. And so it ends up, kind of with a tragic twist. And so, but then the novel leaves the question open as to whether or not whether she achieved atonement through the creation of the alternate ending, or through the final revelation of what actually happened, or if she doesn't ever achieve it at all and she will still pay for what she did for the rest of her life. And the whole book is really heavily laden with symbolism. You realize that the play she started writing as a child, The Trials of Arabella, you realize that the plot of that play is very similar to the altered version of the book, and that play is now being performed. You know, she's going to the closing night of that performance at the end of the book, and so it kind of mirrors. It's a self-referential. It mirrors Atonement itself, and so it's got a lot of depth of, theme and symbolism.